All right, welcome folks. As you know, the first few slides are things you've already seen, so we'll get started with those. Thank you all so much for being here. It's our 6th and final session of the Spring 2023 Recruitment Boot Camp. You've all been with us for 5 sessions so far, and we're going to get started on this 6th session, Key Retention and Development Topics, A Jedi Lens. Next slide. I know, Parker, it's so sad that it's over, but you can always come hang out with us on virtually or at our events, etc. So as you all know, we're the Association of Clinicians for the Underserved, or ACU. We have a lot of different programs, but today we're here on behalf of, next slide, the STAR Center, which is a program of ACU that focuses specifically on health center staff recruitment and retention. And we're one of your 21 National Training and Technical Assistance partners. And we have our very own website that's separate from the ACU website, just so you can access everything that we create easily. Next slide. As you know, this session will be recorded and the slide deck will be shared on that discussion board that you will have access to in perpetuity. Feel free to use the chat or unmute yourself. As you know, we're an interactive group. If you have any questions, comments, or thoughts, and Mariah, as always, is your technology helper if anything is going wrong, if you're having trouble connecting. And of course, please complete the evaluation at the end. Next slide. This is your STAR Center team. We're all here, not today, but just in general for to be helpful to you. Next slide. And your hosts for this learning collaborative are myself, Alex, and Mariah. You've heard from Alex and I, and Mariah has been helping us all with technology and doing all that behind the scenes work throughout the presentation, or throughout, all the sessions. Next slide. So really quickly, before we jump into today's content, we're not going to have a breakout, but I just want to check in and see if anyone has any questions or reflections from the last session's homework on contracting and onboarding. Was there anything that came up or anything anyone wanted to discuss before we jump into today's content?
Hi, this is Sandra Green. I did have a quick question for you. What's the latest that we can send over those job announcements for review? I was on vacation last week, so I didn't get a chance to send them over.
Yeah, totally fine. Let's say June 15th.
Perfect. Thank you so
Just
much.
because, yeah, of course. Yeah. And honestly, if you sent them after that, I would still review them. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. All right, great. Well, if anyone has any other questions about that, feel free to put them on the discussion board or email us about onboarding and contracting, or if you have any questions that have come up throughout or as you're reflecting on any of the topics that we've discussed on the boot camp, please feel free to bring those up. And with that, I will hand it over to Sabrina Edgington, our Senior Director of Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Initiatives here at ACU, and I'll let her introduce herself a little bit more. Sabrina.
Great. Thank you so much, Helen, and thank you to everyone who showed up for this last session. Really excited to be here. I'm always excited to be working collaboratively with the STAR Center team, but specifically and just really excited about talking about retention and development using a Jedi lens. So I've actually been working at ACU for about 4 years, but I've got 15 years working with health centers, primarily working at the intersection of homelessness and health. So this is work that is very dear to me and something I've actually been doing advocacy around racial justice for over 25 years. So I'm very open to having really frank and honest conversations. I know we're all in a learning journey. We're all in different places in our learning journey. I am still learning and I am always going to make mistakes. So I ask for your grace and also offer you my grace in terms of feeling free to just, ask questions. Don't worry about making mistakes. Don't worry about, having, the perception, because this is where we're here. We're here to learn and to grow and to collectively be better. And so I just want to offer that before we get started. So our learning objectives today are to describe belonging and inclusion as key recruitment and retention strategies. We're also going to identify some of those common factors that create a stressful work environment for people who identify with a minoritized or underrepresented group. Then we want to talk about some of those opportunities to create a work environment where people want to stay. I'm also going to be including in that conversation some equitably some equitable development opportunities. Sorry, I can't talk today. So one of the things that I'd like to ask before we even jump into belonging and inclusion at the individual level, which is where we often think about belonging and inclusion, is how well does somebody belong or feel like they belong to our organization? Do they feel included within our organizational culture? But I want to spend a minute just talking a little bit about whether or not your organization belongs to your community, because that's a big part of belonging and inclusion, is whether or not we ourselves belong to our community, and does our community see us as an ally? So I want you to be thinking about some of those organizations that have a strong presence in your community. So these are the community organizations that are always showing up to rallies, who are leading policy change efforts, who are leading town hall discussions, who you see showing up for media events to talk about some of the policies that are impacting the populations that they serve, some of the social injustice within your community. This could be related to any number of different things. It could be related to housing and homelessness. It could be related to reproductive health. One issue that is coming up in a lot of states right now, for example, in Nashville, I'm in Nashville, Tennessee, and in Tennessee, there's a lot of efforts to restrict gender affirming care. And so think about those organizations that come to mind for you whenever there is community effort happening around a social injustice or community efforts to improve the health and wellness of your community. Think about who comes to mind front and center in terms of other community-based organizations, and just put that in the chat. And while you're thinking about that, I'll share an example from Nashville, Tennessee. So I mentioned already that I have been very involved in efforts that really fall at the intersection of homelessness and health. So I try to stay tuned to what's going on in that area. So whenever there are efforts to sweep a homeless encampment and displace individuals, these are things I'm aware of. New policies that would criminalize homelessness. Efforts that are being made to try to expand Medicaid in our state, since we have not become an expansion state. Who's leading those efforts? Who's front and center? And there's always one organization that comes to mind, and it's an organization called Open Table Nashville. And not only are they at every town hall meeting, sometimes they're front and center at rallies and marches. They're leading the letter writing campaigns. I see them being interviewed in the media. And so members of our community, especially those who are really engaged in homelessness and housing, and especially people experiencing homelessness, really know that this organization is an ally, that they are there because they are really invested in supporting their health and wellness and addressing social injustices. And so that's important for us to really be thinking about, because how we show up in the community is going to be drawing in folks who are very mission driven, who want to be part of an organization that's mission driven. And it also really helps us understand that recruitment doesn't only live with HR. Your health center's programs, initiatives, and community engagement is going to be drawing people into your organization. So we all really have a role when it comes to recruiting folks into our organization and creating that sense of belonging. So I don't see anything in the chat yet. Here we go. Community Clinic Association of Los Angeles County. Yes, great. Any others? And maybe what I'd love to do is just invite you to share a little bit about how you're seeing that organization show up. So Sandra, if you're interested, if you could unmute and share, like, how do you see CCA LAC showing up in your community?
No, in various forms, they're spearheading JEDI. They are offering internships to various schools. So that's one of the things that we're participating in. They're stay abreast of all the policies and procedures and things that are changing legislation-wise, regulation-wise. They're sending out weekly updates and reports. So they kind of keep us abreast of what's going on, and we can ask them questions and they will follow up with, the necessary representatives to get those answers. So they're very, very helpful and resourceful for us in all aspects. They provide various trainings to the members.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
And then Helen, I see you wrote Mutual Aid Monday, Harm Reduction Action Center, and the GES Coalition. I want to invite you to share, like, how do you see them showing up in your community?
Yeah, for sure. So Mutual Aid Monday is a group in my community. I live in Denver, that hosts a weekly dinner outside of the city and county building on Monday, which is when our city council meets. And it is primarily geared to people experiencing homelessness, but there's food, there's clothes, there's like hygiene things, barbers and hairdressers come, and people do like AccuDetox stuff. And it is just like really this big community event front and center in front of our elected officials to like remind them that people experiencing homelessness are part of the community. And then the Harm Reduction Action Center is it's not a safe use site, but they provide tools for safe use. But then in addition to doing that, they're also close to the Capitol, so they're like really interact with our elected officials, but they also host a weekly like neighborhood cleanup where they like go around and pick up trash and all those kinds of things. And then the GES Coalition is this group of folks that advocates for this really like systemically marginalized 3 neighborhoods that are the most polluted neighborhoods in the United States. And they work to like make sure that the people who live there, their voices are actually heard. But again, they do a lot of like beyond the advocacy, they like host events to bring people together so that we like feel like we're all part of that community. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so I want to share some different ways that your organization can really feel to your community members like you're an ally, like you're part of their community, because those, like I said before, people who are mission driven, they want to work for those organizations that they feel are making an impact, that they feel like are having an impact on local policies that might be creating harm for members of their community. And there are a lot of different ways that people can do that. One, you can encourage community discussions and even invite members of your community to come into your health center to have conversations. So for example, I know a lot of our health centers right now in Tennessee are having a lot of conversations about the restrictions on trans health laws, what that is doing for, one, their health centers, but also the impact on their patients. And a lot of their patients are very concerned and want to know what are the resources available to them. So in addition to using your space as a place where people can convene and talk, you can invite local leaders to come share their perspectives and talk about some of the areas where you have some aligning mission, because a lot of your work is aligning with a lot of the other social justice efforts out there, because we know that racism, we know that environmental health, all of those are structural and social determinants of health. And so there's a lot of alignment with what your health center is doing and hoping to achieve with their patients and some of the other work that's happening there. You can also participate in local events, like what Helen was saying. There are local events where some of these organizations will show up and have a table. So I've seen a lot of harm reduction organizations come up and share information and resources about harm reduction, even pass out harm reduction resources like condoms or some resources on how to use naloxone. And so that's another way that you can engage in your communities, having a table to do that type of work. There is an organization, a national organization called Punk Rock Saves Lives, and I'm very much involved in our punk rock scene, and they show up at all the different like big events, and they coordinate fundraisers, and they have a harm reduction table. They have resources for people who are not doing well, who might be considering suicide. They are always there, and so people have become familiar with them as a resource, and they are part of our community. You can also take advantage of having your ambassadors help support this work by bringing people into your community, bringing people to your table if you're attending an event. So again, like in Nashville, the Equity Alliance, they have big neighborhood barbecues, and this would be a great place for health centers to have a table to talk about, here's how you can access free and low cost care. Here's how we can help you access prescriptions. Here are some other resources that are available to you, and so that they know that you're part of that community. Promoting opportunities to volunteer, really engaging with folks where there's that aligning mission where you can support each other. For example, there are a lot of efforts to around policing, and there are efforts to really move some of the funding that are going to policing to more mental health services to support outreach workers and help create a different pathway for people who might be experiencing mental illness to mental health facilities rather than through the carceral system. So there are different ways that your organization can be working with some of your community partners. But one thing that's also important for this is the consistency. So you want to show up regularly at these events, and so that they see you and they think about you. So when they're thinking about, you know, I want to work in a place where I feel like I belong, where I feel like I'm included, that's really part of our community, they're going to think of your organization. So I just have this one slide where I really wanted to focus in on how well our organization belongs to the community, but I am going to be sending the majority of this webinar on how well people as individuals feel like they belong and are included within your organization. But I did think it was important to cover this. And again, the takeaway here is that recruitment doesn't always belong in HR. Recruitment can also happen within your programming and services and your community engagement. So just really wanting to make sure that we're all part of this recruitment effort. So when we talk about the overlap of recruitment and retention, you've probably heard from our Star Center team, retention is recruitment. And that is so true for a number of different reasons. One, we want to make sure that the folks who are employed at our organizations enjoy working at our organizations. So do they feel supported and included in the organization? Do they feel like they can show up authentically? If so, they may be more likely to recommend to their friends and family open job positions or recommend them for jobs at your organization. Some of you have probably seen this meme over to the right, and it went viral for a reason, because a lot of people are working in places where they don't feel valued, where they don't feel like they are welcome, and they would tell people to run for their lives if they were to apply for a job there. So we want to make sure our current workforce is happy and is valued, because that word of mouth is a really great way to recruit from your community. And if people are not happy at your organization, they're not going to recommend to their friends and families to come work at your organization. Additionally, if they're happy and really invested in the mission, they're going to reach out to their friends and family who have skill sets that you're really looking for, because they want to see the organization thrive. They are invested in your success. And so it's not just like, oh, you know, my friend needs a job. It's, oh, my friend who is doing this really amazing work here may be interested in this new position, and I want to be able to see, you know, I'm going to send them this job description to see if they might be interested in working here. The other overlap that exists in the retention is recruitment area is that we want to be able to recruit from our own workforce. So folks who are really invested and feel valued in your organization may want to grow their careers within your organization. So for example, if somebody is starting as a medical assistant and they may be interested in pursuing a degree in nursing because they've been so inspired by some of the nurses at your staff, and maybe your organization has some professional development opportunities and can help them, then they might be wanting to grow their careers within your organization. So you're seeing less attrition, but more people moving up in the organization. And then also, excuse me, and also we like to think about the idea of re-recruiting our employees. And this is really important, especially today with inflation, because a lot of employees who have been at your organization for years and have a lot of experience may be able to find an entry-level job at their same salary or higher somewhere else, because now employers are really understanding that I can no longer start the salary at the same range that we had 5 years ago. It's a lot different now. And so you want to be making sure that the folks who are already to your organization, already invested, are still in that same, or are receiving that pay equity. So they're keeping up with inflation, so they're not leaving for other jobs. So how are we constantly re-recruiting the people who are already your organization? So when we talk about people feeling valued and supported in your organization, I'm just re-emphasizing that that is going to promote retention. It's going to promote recruitment, because people will talk to their friends and families and share job positions or job openings. However, what we're seeing is that not everyone feels valued or respected at work, especially when we're thinking about minoritized and underrepresented groups. So in this survey that was conducted by SHRM, or the Society for Human Resource Management, they found that 33% of Black workers do not feel respected or valued at work. Another survey found that 1 in 3 Black, Indigenous, and other people of color report feeling fatigue related to racial tensions or issues at work. And I'm going to talk about some of those racial issues and tensions and what might contribute to those in just a moment. But I want to do some level setting first. So the idea of inclusion and belonging is very different, but also a little vague. There's a little bit of blurring of boundaries. And so I want us to do some level setting so that we understand first what is inclusion and what is belonging. And we're going to start with inclusion. So inclusion is the notion that an organization or system is welcoming to new populations or identities, and that this new presence is not merely tolerated, but expected to contribute meaningfully. So that's the part I really want to home in on. It's expected to contribute meaningfully. And so I want to open up for discussion. What does it mean to contribute meaningfully at your place of employment? Like when you think about meaningful contribution, or somebody feeling like they are meaningfully contributing to your organization, what does that mean? What comes to mind? And you can unmute or just use your chat. Any thoughts? So some of the things, feeling heard, absolutely. Like how are the things that you're sharing, the things that you're saying from your own lived experience and your own experience in your community being incorporated into programming and decision making? Are people listening to what you're saying and how that can benefit the organization? Absolutely. I think some of the other things that come to mind for me when I think about contributing meaningfully is who is getting the spotlight work. Some people call it the rock star work, but that's the work that's really going to create those types of outcomes that get the accolades, the ones that get the recognition. Like who's getting like the work that's going to be rewarded and everybody's going to be really excited about, versus who's getting kind of the tasks and roles and responsibilities that nobody really wants, or that isn't necessarily, it's important to the organization, but is not recognized as much as, say, a big initiative that is going to, that you're doing with, like, say, the rescue mission that's going to get people into housing and provide supportive services and maybe make the news. So who's getting that really meaningful work? You need to be thinking about that in terms of meaningful contributions at your organization. And Alex says, seeing your impact, as Sabrina said, knowing others are also seeing it, recognizing you for that impact. Exactly. And so making sure that there are ways that you are, because everybody's job is important, right? It all contributes to your mission. So how can people's impact be seen? And so the second question I'd like to pose to you is, how do folks at your organization know that they're contributing meaningfully? Because sometimes you don't know, if whether or not your work had an impact or whether or not people really value what you've done. So how do you even know that what you're doing is meaningful and that others feel like it's meaningful? Recognition and acknowledgement, exactly. Absolutely. So regardless of what their day-to-day tasks are, it's important to tie that into the overall mission of the organization, understanding that this work is important to what you're doing every single day. Seeing projects or initiatives to completion, absolutely. Thank you. So now I want to talk a little bit about belonging. So belonging is a little bit different than inclusion. And it is a feeling of being happy or comfortable as part of a particular group and having a good relationship with the other members of the group because they welcome and accept you. So you see a theme in terms of inclusion and belonging. There's some overlap in terms of feeling welcome, but whereas inclusion is really feeling like you are meaningfully contributing to the organization, that you are heard and it's supporting the organization's mission. Belonging is more about, like, are you happy when you show up at your organization? Do you have a good relationship with others? Do other people welcome and accept you? And so I want to ask you again, what do you think of when you think of a welcome and accepting environment? What does that look like for you? And I'll let you take time to think about that. And you can think about your own experiences. What is it at your work that makes you feel accepted and welcomed? Positive interactions, colleagues using mindful languages, absolutely. Mutual respect. Yep. Being trusted with tasks or projects. Absolutely. So these are all the things that we really need to be a genuine interest in getting to know each other. Absolutely. Coming together with folks with a spirit of curiosity and wanting to know who they are as a person. When I'm seen for my passions and those are respected as valid. Yes, absolutely. So these are the things we want to be thinking about when we think about creating an environment where somebody feels like they belong. Like, how is that being applied for all of your employees? And so a lot of that ties into some of the workplace stressors that impact belonging and inclusion for folks who identify with minoritized or underrepresented or stigmatized groups. And I want to go over a few different concepts today. The first is assimilation and code switching. The second is microaggressions. And then I also want to talk about tokenism and the minority tax. So some of these concepts you might be familiar with, but I want us to dig deeper into some of these and how these impact belonging and inclusion and how these might create emotional stress and exhaustion for some of our colleagues. So I want to start with assimilation. Assimilation is when you make the minority group resemble the majority group, right? We see this often in our organizations, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what symptoms of assimilation look like within your organization. But what we're really trying to achieve is integration. So the blending of cultures, because we want to remember that diversity is just a number unless folks feel valued and heard, and that they're able to contribute their perspectives and lived experiences and cultures into day-to-day programming, into service delivery, into decision making. But if folks are not able to show up authentically and bring their cultures and are in a space where they're being asked to assimilate to a very specific professional norm, they may be holding that back. And so you're not only is your organization not going to be able to benefit from those different perspectives and lived experiences, but that's your community is also not going to be able to benefit from that as well. And we know it's those lived experiences and perspectives that really help to create a culturally responsive organization. So again, we're really focusing on how do we go from assimilation to integration where we're blending cultures. And I want to talk a little bit about professionalism, because this is a big sticking point whenever I do these types of presentations, because a lot of people feel like, you know, if we don't have professional norms, then our organization is going to be lawless. And so I want to talk a little bit about this. And I want to share a quote that was written by Asa Gray in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. And she says, professionalism has become coded language for white favoritism in workplace practices that more often than not privilege the values of white and Western employees and leave behind people of color. So I want us to think about that for a minute and think about, where does the culture of professionalism come from? So how long has this culture of professionalism been maintained across various different workplaces and environments? How did it look in the 50s versus how does it look today? And I'd love to hear from you. What does it mean? Like what comes to mind when you hear that professionalism is really, more often than not, privilege the values of white and Western employees and leave people of color behind? What comes to mind for you when you hear that quote? And this is a really hard one. And that's one of the reasons why I included this in the slide, because, you know, we have, from the beginning of our education to our first jobs to jobs that we have now, we've been told what is professionalism. We've seen that professionalism is often rewarded. So those who are succeeding most in the organization are often more in line with professional norms that have already been set. So Helen says, policies, ideas about hair is professional. Absolutely. Hair comes to mind. So a lot of times people think about dress code when it comes to professionalism. So we think if we don't have, you know, these norms already set in place, people are going to show up in flip-flops and tank tops, and it's going to be lawless. People are going to be cursing, calling each other bruh. And that's not necessarily the example. We kind of come at professionalism as from a place of fear. And it's something that we've maintained and upheld for so many decades that it has become our norm within the organization. But it is not a norm that has really been developed from a multicultural mindset. And Alex says, it's an easy excuse if you don't personally like someone else's way of approaching something and want to admonish or penalize them for it, to say they're unprofessional. Absolutely. Thank you. It encouraging and praising assertiveness. Exactly. So I want to give you an example of some symptoms of assimilation. So you might recognize these within your organization, but you might recognize these from past employers. But some symptoms of assimilation is rigid expectations about how professionalism is defined. So if you're hearing a lot of people say that's just not professional, maybe question that, like, why is that not professional? How are you defining professionalism? Hiring for culture fit is a big one. So when we're doing interviews, there's often this conversation like, do you think they'd be a good fit with our organization? And what we're really looking for here is culture add. If we hire this person, how can we grow as an organization through their perspectives and lived experiences? How can this benefit our community and the people we serve? So not necessarily hiring someone who already fits into the professional norms and standards that have been established. Hearing things such as, this is how we do things here, or that's not how we do things here, because there are many, many ways that things can be done. And it's not always the one way that it has been done over the course of many years. Rewarding conformity, that's one of the things that I already mentioned. So there's this idea of how somebody should show up at work. And those who are growing within the ranks and receiving promotions might be more in line with those professional norms and standards. And that is going to really have an impact on folks who are coming into your organization and create more assimilation, because people are saying, this is what I need to do in order to grow within the organization. And so people are more likely to conform to those standards, but then that also means you're not benefiting from the different perspectives that they might bring to your organization and how you might be able to change some things within your organizational culture to be more inclusive. And then avoiding conflict is another symptom, because change does not come without conflict. For many folks, especially if you've been at an organization for many years, you might say this isn't broken or I change it, but maybe it's not working for everybody. Maybe there's a new way of doing things. Our cultures evolve, people evolve. And so I want to make sure that as we're thinking about conflict arising, think of it as more of a constructive exercise. So why is conflict arising? What is it that people think should change? What do they dislike? And maybe have an open conversation about that, or engage in that with a spirit of curiosity rather than really dogmatically sticking to a specific way that something is done. And so one of the things that we're seeing when folks are really being forced to assimilate into a culture so that they can have some of the same privileges and benefits as their peers, is that we're seeing something called code switching, which is very common. And a lot of us engage in code switching in different ways in our personal life and in our work life. But what code switching means is it's adjusting one's style of speech, appearance, behavior, and expression in ways that will optimize the comfort of others in exchange for fair treatment, quality service, and employment opportunities. And I'm wondering, maybe just with a raise of hands, how many of you have heard the word code switching before? Yeah. So first, I usually, when I'm talking about code switching, it's usually about 50% of the folks who are on the webinar who have heard of code switching before. And and as I mentioned before, that, we do this a lot in our personal and in our work lives, but it can be very exhausting. So for example, studies done looking at code switching found that folks who are not able to show up authentically, who feel like they need to adhere to a professional norm that doesn't necessarily align with their culture, it can deplete their cognitive resources and it hinders performance, because it can be emotionally and mentally exhausting to be someone you're not all day. It reduces authentic self-expression. So again, we're not benefiting from an organization, our community is not benefiting from the perspectives and lived experiences and cultures they bring if they cannot be their authentic selves. And in the end, it contributes to burnout. So we're seeing a lot of burnout from folks who feel like they have to code switch at work every day. So I want to talk about some other areas where there might be culture misalignment. So we talked about hair and dress, which is what we often think about when we talk about assimilation. But there are other characteristics of organizations that also are very much rooted in white and Western culture. And so there's a document called Characteristics of White Supremacy Culture, written by Tima Okun. This document, so there's a link to it here, there's a guide and a website that actually goes with it. And I've seen it make its rounds within the various communities that I'm involved in, including DEI educators, including other national training and technical assistance providers, including primary care associations. This document has made its round across a lot of the different communities I engage with, because one, it was a wake-up call for a lot of us, because a lot of us who are really working, and we all know that we're always learning and we're never perfect, but we had to really rethink some of these characteristics that really embody our own personalities. Now, not all of these things are always bad, but they can be opportunities for growth. For me, for example, perfectionism is something that I am keenly aware that I have adopted. I will spend hours to make sure the fonts are correct and the grammar is correct. But it can become a problem when I see mistakes by others as a personal attribute and that person is inadequate. So you might have a perfectionist trait, which might help you in your work, and it might be something that has helped you do better in your work. But when you start to apply that to others and judge others by your own personal standards and start to see others as inadequate, that can be really harmful. And so it's something for us to reflect on and think about, am I doing that? So, this is not how I would do it. And I'm seeing a lot of things that might, bother me if it were my document, but how do we make sure that some of these characteristics that we have within ourselves are not harming other people? Another one is urgency. So we all have had experiences where urgency is required, right? So for example, sometimes HRSA will release a grant announcement and you've got 3 weeks to put together an 80-page grant proposal. And that's gonna create quite a lot of urgency. There are emergency rooms constantly in a state of urgency. However, urgency often eliminates the time needed for an inclusive and democratic decision-making process in favor of quick results. And so we want to think about, what have we compromised in order to put something together urgently and quickly? And so in the end, you may end up with a 3-year program that's funded by an institution that a lot of your staff felt like, who designed this program? I didn't have any say in this, and this is not going to fly with our community. And so you want to make sure that you're taking the time to be democratic and inclusive in your decision-making process, so that there's not only is there buy-in, but again, so that you're really taking time to engage as many people as you can into the thought process so that it is inclusive to your community. Something else that was also in, and these are only just like 4 out of many different characteristics, by the way. I do invite you to go and look through that because there's a lot of examples under each one of these. So only one right way. So if there's something that you guys are doing in your organizations that very specifically need to be done a very specific way, that does disregard the many ways in which individuals engage and perform. So you might want to think about, is this the only way? Are there other ways that this can be done quite successfully? And then either or thinking, which incapacitates an individual organization's ability to deal with complexity, because not everything is an either or scenario. We want to think about the nuances that come with some of the work that we're doing. An example of this might be, and something that I think everybody here is probably familiar with, is health outcome metrics, right? So in our work in healthcare, we're very metric oriented, right? Success is defined a very specific way by our funders. If somebody has high blood sugar level, success is defined by lowering that blood sugar level. So it's either you did or you did not achieve success based on that specific number. But it doesn't take into account the complexity of an individual situation. So for example, people experiencing homelessness are very much dependent on soup kitchens. And we know that the food that is shared at or provided at soup kitchens are often high in sodium, high in fat, high in carbs, and aren't necessarily the most nutritious. And so we also think about cultural foods and people being asked to limit the intake of their cultural foods. But this individual that you've been working with may have taken 1 day a week to start exercising. They may have cut out soda. And those are big wins. Those are, not unimportant outputs, but we're often beholden to this either or thinking. So because they didn't see a drop in their blood sugar level, then you have failed and they have failed. And then that is seen as a personal flaw in the individual. And sometimes clinicians can take that as a personal flaw in themselves, even though there were some actual successes in there. So it's just, this document, again, is just a way to really look at some of the cultures and the characteristics that are very common across organizations and reflect on whether or not these are harmful and whether or not we're making these harmful for other people and other cultures. You may not necessarily adhere to these same characteristics. And I'd love to hear from you all. What does blending of cultures look like in the workplace? So we talked a little bit about, assimilating to professional norms versus blending of cultures. What does that look like when we're asking folks to bring themselves authentically, to have a voice, to help inform decisions? What does blending of cultures look like in a workplace? And I feel like this is a hard one, but I think there are really good examples among our health center communities. Celebration of cultural holidays, absolutely, yes. I think it wasn't until, very recently that a lot of organizations started to, our federal government actually really made Juneteenth a federal holiday. And look at how long that took. Respect for different diet preferences, having options to everyone, exactly. We hear a lot of that clinicians are telling people that their cultural foods are unhealthy for them or not good for them. But, that's kind of a huge thing to say to someone when that's so much part of their culture. So how can we engage in a collaborative conversation about that? And really think about some other ways that we can address dietary needs. Celebrating various cultures, having potlucks, sharing cultural dishes, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. So I want to move on and talk about microaggressions. And I know we've all heard of microaggressions, and I want to spend a little bit more time really dissecting this and digging deep into why these are so emotionally exhausting for folks and how it can create a work environment where people just don't feel like they belong. So microaggressions, the term was coined in 1970 by a Harvard professor and psychiatrist named Chester Pierce to describe those subtle insults and slights that he was seeing on a daily basis that was being experienced by his Black students. So he started to call these microaggressions. The term has started to morph and evolve over the last 50 years. And today we see that as an intentional or unintentional statement or action, often hostile or derogatory in nature, that perpetuates a stereotype or otherness toward a stigmatized or marginalized group. Some people have stopped calling it microaggressions because they feel like the fact that it has the term micro attached to it diminishes the huge impact that it causes on somebody emotionally and mentally. The exhaustiveness of it when you're experiencing this every day of your life. Some people call them subtle acts of exclusion. And oftentimes the microaggression is not even intended to be hostile or derogatory in nature. Some people commit these acts without knowing. They often come in the spirit of inclusion. I will give a very specific example for me, anyways, in my own personal experience, because I know my experience as an Asian person is going to be a lot different from someone who is Black or someone who is Indigenous or Latinx, and it's going to be different based on the politics of your community. But people have, I've experienced microaggressions, and I think the folks who are saying these are coming from a very good place and wanting to connect in some way, but maybe they're just being weird about it and don't really know the etiquette. So for example, I am Korean, but I've had people tell me, hey, I have a Chinese neighbor, you should meet them. And I don't quite understand, for me, I'm just like, why did you just say that? Like, I would never go to somebody and say, hey, I have a white neighbor, you should meet them. Or do you know so-and-so, he's also white. It's just, and so for me, it just really perpetuates my otherness and how folks have really kind of put me in a group that I don't necessarily belong in. So we know that a lot of Asian cultures are often kind of lumped together as one big group, even though we have many different cultures and beliefs and ethnicities within that big overarching group of Asian. So I want to share like some of the more common examples of microaggressions that we hear and talk a little bit about them, about why are they so hurtful. So I think the one that we're very familiar with is, can I touch your hair? It seems very benign, and I think a lot of people come at it because they're trying to be friendly, but in the end it is very offensive, because as we heard or as we saw in the chat, a lot of people have been discriminated against for their hair. A lot of people have been asked to change their natural hair in order to fit into professional norms and standards. But if you think about the history of our country and our society, people have been, especially Black, Indigenous, other people of color, have been very much exoticized for their features. There is a book called Medical Apartheid. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's very eye-opening in terms of how people of color, primarily Black people, have been exploited and used not only for scientific experiments, but also for our own amusement. And part of the, there's a whole section in the book that talks about Barnum and Bailey and how people, Black and Asian, were put in cages for people's amusement, to the point that even they had a cage where a Black person was put in a cage with an ape so that they could supposedly provide education about evolution. And even the New York Times wrote an article justifying this. Of course, members of the Black community came out and said, this is messed up and we need to stop this immediately. And so, but when you start to think about that history, that exploitation, that seeing people as exotic, it's something for our own amusement. Can I touch your hair is actually, really offensive. So a lot of people don't know that context, and they think it's not that big of a deal, and they think people are being sensitive, but it is actually quite a big deal. The name of the book is called Medical Apartheid. And the example I gave is from that book, because I myself do not have that experience of people saying, can I touch your hair? So I wanted to make sure I give due credit to where those examples come from. You people is something that is said a lot, and it often feels, again, like you're being othered and excluded from your society and your community. Where are you from? No, where are you really from? That happens a lot to folks who are American-born citizens, but also from Asian ethnicity, for example, or another ethnicity, where people just feel like, well, you're only from here if you only look like you're from here if you are white or Black. Otherwise, you clearly came from somewhere else. Being asked why you're so loud, especially to a Black person or group, this happens a lot. We've seen where people have called the police on groups, families who are coming together for family reunions, or people who are talking on the phone. That is seen as an aggressive act. To women, asking women to smile is really, it really reinforces the idea that women are there to nurture and appease other people, and that we need to prioritize another person's comfort by smiling. So that is a microaggression. For a transgender person, you look great for someone who used to be. That is really offensive. To a fat person, you're so brave to wear that is really offensive. So we want to think about like the history of the stigmatization that people have experienced. We really need to think about the fact that people are trying to belong in their society, but some of these things are really othering us and making us feel excluded from our communities. Are there any other ones that anybody would like to share that maybe you've experienced? Okay, well, if you think of any, put them in the chat, or if you want to share any, feel free to unmute. Do you have a nickname? I was once asked why I wasn't wearing a dress in a professional setting. Absolutely. On the phone, you sound white. Those are all microaggressions. And in fact, I know in the Korean culture, a lot of my family and friends have changed their names because people got their names wrong so often and couldn't pronounce them, that they come up with what they call American names so that people are more easily able to refer to them. And so they've really given up a big part of their identity, because in Korean culture, having the two first names is really related to your family of origin. There are plenty of generationally focused ones. Ageist remarks, young people today, that's impressive, they're still working at this age. Right, and there's also like the assumptions that older people are not technologically savvy, like, oh, I'm surprised you can do that. And so those are all things that we're assuming based on stereotypes. We're really engaging in stereotypes when we're doing this. So another thing that makes microaggressions so exhausting is the invalidation and gaslighting that often comes with it. So why are you being so sensitive? So if somebody attempts to touch your hair or tells you to smile and you don't want to smile, you're having a bad day, maybe your cat just died that day, things are happening, you're a human, but somebody is feeling uncomfortable because you're not smiling. Why are you being so sensitive? It's a big deal. They may not understand what's going on. They may not understand the history of the remark that they said and how that has impacted people you identify with and yourself. I was just trying to compliment you. You're overreacting. I'm not racist. I have a lot of Black friends. I don't see color. Or if you report it, just ignore it. That often is something, because other people don't see these microaggressions as such a big deal. So like, just ignore it. But it is emotionally exhausting, again, because it happens every single day, often to people who are who do identify with minoritized or stigmatized or underrepresented groups. So we have to recognize that exhaustion. Now, when it happens at work, it can be even more emotionally exhausting, because there's a lot of emotional labor that comes with that. So some of the things that somebody might have to navigate and really try to determine whether or not they're going to respond to it is, if I respond, will this impact my position in the organization? If I respond, will the person become defensive, and will this lead to an argument? If I respond, how will this affect my relationship with this coworker? If I don't respond, does that convey that I accept this behavior statement? If I don't respond, will I regret not saying anything? That's a lot to weigh from one remark from somebody, because it does have that heavy emotional impact. And so somebody is going to have to weigh the pros and cons of being able to correct someone when they do perform or engage in a microaggression. And some people do choose to ignore it, because addressing it can be more emotionally exhaustive, because they would have to explain why it was harmful. They might then have to engage in being invalidated or being gaslit. And so some people may smile and move on. And again, that's contributing to their feeling of whether or not they belong in the organization and whether they feel included in the organization. So it's really understand that we understand what microaggressions are and what the impact of those are. And when I talk about emotional labor, I really like sharing this invoice. I wish I knew who to credit for this. This again made its rounds across social media for DEI educators, but it talks about the emotional labor that people experience at work. And you can see this is like a receipt. So I'm going to bill you because I helped you understand why what you did is racist or sexist or ableist. Or I'm going to bill you because I endured your microaggression, taught you about your microaggression, explained something you could have Googled, clarified that you're not entitled to my time. And so all of this adds to emotional labor, to stress, and to burnout. So I want to talk a little bit about minority tax. Again, how many of you have heard of the term minority tax? I usually get a different response from the various different trainings that I do. So a couple of people, Helen's heard of it. So minority tax is something that is that we really need to look out for. So minority tax is the extra financially uncompensated duties and responsibilities that minorities are asked to perform to increase diversity at their institutions. So let's think about you're putting together a JEDI committee or a DEI committee or a task force. Obviously, you want to have representation on that committee, right? However, are you asking folks who identify with a minoritized group to carry all of that work without extra compensation? So on top of all the other work that they're already being asked to do, are you asking them to lead the charge to make your organization more diverse, equitable, and inclusion? So you need to be thinking about, are you taxing folks? Are people becoming emotionally exhaustive? Are they being exploited at the expense of your DEI efforts? So this one is a really hard one because you do want that representation, but you need to make sure that the individuals who are invited or who volunteer want to do this work, because not everybody wants to do this work. It's very taxing, it's emotionally hard. You're often having to explain multiple times throughout the day why something is discriminatory or biased. And with this work, you often have to prove racism and bias exists before people will even listen. It's emotionally burdensome, emotionally hard work. So people should be compensated fairly for it if they're participating in these. So if somebody does volunteer to participate in a committee, if someone does volunteer to lead your DEI book club or to review a policy procedure or be part of a diverse hiring committee, how are you carving out time in their schedule, taking things off their plate so that they can engage and compensating them fairly for that labor? Another thing that we need to really be careful of is tokenism. And so tokenism is a practice of doing something such as hiring a person who belongs to a minority group only to prevent criticism and give the appearance that people are being treated fairly. And so when you stop at recruitment and you recruit people because you want diversity in your organization, but those folks are not given the opportunity to inform programming policy, their perspectives and lived experience aren't embedded to the culture, that can be tokenism. And so one of the things that I like to share is Einstein's ladder. It's an older ladder, and so I've replaced some of the words with more modern words, but it really talks about the degrees of citizen participation. A lot of folks get an overview of this ladder, like in social work, it's something that we talked about. So we talk about participation in 3 different categories. You've got non-participation, you've got tokenism, and then you've got citizen control, which means that people's voices are really guiding decisions within the organization. So looking at the lower 2 lungs in terms of non-participation, the older terms that were used was therapy and manipulation, but manipulation is now what we see as gaslighting. So, oh, it's not that bad here, or that's not how things really are. You're seeing it the wrong way. That's manipulating somebody, that's gaslighting somebody. Therapy is assimilation. So this person is not doing it the right way. So we're going to fix them and help them do things the way that we do it. So that's more where assimilation comes in. So gaslighting, assimilation, that is non-participation. And then when you get into tokenism, this is where I see a lot of organizations. So we're inviting people from minoritized and underrepresented and stigmatized groups to inform our work, to provide consultation, to provide placation. That in itself is tokenism, because even though they're informing, they're sharing their perspectives, even though they're consulting with you, their voice, they have no control over decision making. So they're being invited to the table, but whether or not their lived experiences and perspectives are actually used to inform decisions still depends on whoever is in control at the top. And then when you see the actual citizen control and integration and inclusion, this is where we see partnership. We're all working together to provide a service that takes into account all of our skills, it takes into account all of our experiences. Delegation, we all have a very specific role in implementing this program. And then citizen control in terms of we all have decision-making or decision-making role in this. So that's where we start to see full participation, full inclusion in the work that we're doing in the JEDI space. So this ladder for me is very helpful to understand, is my organization non-participatory? Is my organization engaging in tokenism? Or is my organization truly inclusive and participatory in decision-making at those top three ladders, or those top three rungs? Let me go back. So I've talked a lot about some of the things that can make people feel like they don't belong in an organization or are not included in the organization. And we know, how can we, one, reflect on the culture that we bring to work, reflect on how much we're asking people to assimilate versus how much we're integrating or blending of cultures. And I want to talk a little bit about development. Because retention also is dependent on how much development and resources and support folks are getting from your organization. And so I think of development in two different areas. So one is, what is the support needed to perform well in your current role? And so that's orientation, onboarding, your coaching and supervision, your team integration and support, your mentorship, peer networking and learning. And so when we start to think about this from an equity perspective, we want to start to think about, like, what does who's getting coaching? Like, who's allowed to have access to that? Is it only leadership who's able to get coaching? What does supervision look like for this individual? Is the supervisor actually trained in equity and inclusion? Is the supervisor have the skills to really understand how to engage the people they're supervising and getting their opinions and hearing feedback from them that's going to help the supervisor be better and more inclusive? Team integration and support. Is the support staff only being given, who is receiving support and most support? Are the folks who are part of teams, do they really understand their role and the value of their role in making that team function and how they can work with other members of the team? Or other members of the team biased or discriminatory and maybe not providing them with the support that's needed? Mentorship is also going to be in the next slide that I talk about in terms of career path. But oftentimes when we think about mentorship, we're not often thinking about what does mentorship look like when the mentor themselves have not experienced some of the bias that their mentee might experience. Sometimes it's helpful to have a mentor who understands what it's like to experience bias, understands that there are barriers that they're having to navigate that others may not have to navigate in your work. Mentors who can connect them to their professional networks, in addition to providing some of the other hands-on work that's being done at the organization. And then also think about peer networking and learning. Who is having the opportunity to attend conferences? We're talking about those echo sessions and webinars. Are folks receiving information about webinars? Are those only going to your directors or the physician level staff, like who's getting those opportunities, who has time carved out in their schedules to participate. Is budgeting also accommodating folks who are not at the leadership or director level, but folks who might want to learn and grow within their current position or grow from their current positions. And so when we talk about career pathways, and I realize we are running short on time, I'm sorry, but when we talk about career pathways, some other things that we need to be thinking about in terms of professional development are upskilling, certifications, tuition support for degree, mentorships, and fellowships. And when we think about this with an equitable lens, we know that this is not something that we can provide to every single person within our organization. And this is where we start to see people get stuck. Like, well, if I offer tuition support or pay for someone to get their certificate in this area, I have to do that for everyone. And so there's a culture that needs to be established and nurtured about what does it mean to have equitable professional development and opportunities. And so you might have professional development opportunities that are based on income or based on the fact that someone identifies with a group that is underrepresented within your organization. And so that again is like a whole other webinar on its own, but you want to think about how can you offer these career pathways so that people want to stay within your organization and grow within your organization and get the support that they need. And also there are really great mentorship opportunities that are two-way mentorships. So the let's say somebody has a mentor who is a leader, somebody's getting trained to be a leader within your organization or a supervisor or director. And so that director or leader can also learn from their mentee about different ways to do things, about different perspectives of how things are working within the organization. So it can be a two-way mentorship. And obviously there are a lot of fellowships that are available at the local, national, state level to help people who already have advanced degrees to build their skills in certain areas. And these are usually short-term opportunities, and some are specifically for underrepresented groups. And so the last thing that I really want to share is that development not only needs to lie with the individual who is actually performing the work, but also with their supervisors, because performance is also influenced by supervisor competency, fairness, and respect. And so if somebody is going to succeed in your organization and feel like they belong and are included, their supervisor really needs to be trained on how to be fair, how to be respectful, how to support their supervisees in building up competencies, and need to be able to reflect on their own bias and when that might show up. So we want to make sure that the onus for professional growth and development is not just placed on the individual, but also placed on the folks who are guiding them and supervising them. So with that, I know we only have a few minutes left, or 1 minute left. I want to see if there are any questions. And I also am very well aware that anytime you tell somebody there's only 1 minute left, they're not likely to enter any questions in the chat or come up with questions, but you're always free to reach out to me, reach out to the Star Center team. Happy to address any questions offline, but I'm going to hand it back over to Helen to close us out. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. That was fabulous and so informative. I know I learned a lot, and I get to talk to you pretty regularly. So I imagine everyone else learned a lot too. And we're getting a lot of compliments there in the chat. Next slide. So if you could translate those compliments or any other thoughts into the evaluation, that would be great. It should have just popped up. Again, this is our final session, so this will be the last time we ask you to fill out this specific evaluation, but as always, we really appreciate the feedback. And as you're doing that, we'll go to the next slide. So as I've spoken about before, we're looking for podcast interviewees. So feel free to contact Michelle if you would like to be interviewed for a podcast. That is we're still on the lookout for 1 or 2 more guests. Also, just to call everyone's attention to Mariah just put in the chat that it would be wonderful if you could complete the post assessment for your growth over the entire program, over all 6 of these sessions. That would be wonderful. And then next slide. I believe I've spoken to you about this before, but we have our virtual biennial workforce summit. Registration is live. It's going to be a wonderful couple of days. We'd love to see you there. It's totally free. Lots of experts from the field. And then next slide. We also have our conference coming up that registration is open for, and that will be in person in DC. And we'll have a workforce track and lots of other really great information. The next couple of slides, are our resource slide, which you've seen, but feel free to access any of these tools as you're diving into your R&R work and planning. Next slide. There's the podcast, is great. We've talked about it every time. And then final slide. You can always get in touch with us. Feel free to if you have questions from this session or any other sessions, feel free to put them on the discussion board. We'll continue to check that. It's also a nice place to continue to interact with your peers from this learning collaborative. It has been such a pleasure having you all over these 6 sessions. Thank you so much for your participation. And one more plug for that, completing that post assessment. We'll also email that to you. Is that correct, Mariah? Yes, we will. Great. All right, fantastic. Thank you all so much. Thanks for staying a little bit over, and I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day and week, and we'll see you hopefully sometime soon.